She'd never been more than 20 miles from the farm. The biggest thing she'd ever driven was a tractor. And now she was sitting in the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang, her hands on the controls, the engine roaring so loud she could feel it in her chest. The officer giving instructions was shouting over the noise, telling her where to take it, what airfield to land at, how to handle the crosswinds. She nodded like she understood, but her heart was hammering and her palms were sweating inside her leather gloves. This wasn't a crop duster. This was a fighter plane fresh off the assembly line, headed to a base where combat pilots would fly it into war. And she, a girl from Iowa who'd learned to fly in a borrowed Piper Cub, was the one delivering it. How does a farmer's daughter end up flying military aircraft? How does someone who'd never left her county become one of the most skilled pilots in the country? And what happens when the war ends and the country decides women don't belong in cockpits anymore? Before the war, flying was a dream that seemed impossible. She grew up on a small farm in the Midwest, corn, soybeans, a few head of cattle. Her father worked the land, her mother kept the house and raised the kids. There wasn't money for extras, and there certainly wasn't money for something as wild and impractical as flying lessons. But she'd always been fascinated by planes. As a kid, she'd lie in the fields and watch the occasional crop duster buzz overhead. And she'd think, that's freedom. That's what it looks like to escape. When she was 16, a barnstormer came through town, one of those traveling pilots who did stunts at county fairs for a few dollars. He offered rides for a quarter, and she begged her father until he relented. 5 minutes in the air changed everything. The roar of the engine, the wind in her face, the way the ground fell away, and suddenly the whole world opened up beneath her. She knew right then this was what she wanted. Not marriage, not the farm, flying. But wanting and getting were two different things. Women didn't fly. Not seriously, anyway. Sure, there were a handful of famous aviatrixes, Amelia Earhart, Jacqueline Cochran, but those were rich, glamorous women with connections, not farm girls from Iowa. Still, she couldn't let it go. She saved every penny she earned from odd jobs, cleaning houses, working at the general store, helping with harvests on neighboring farms. And when she turned 18, she found a local pilot willing to teach her in exchange for work. She scrubbed his plane, pumped fuel, did whatever he needed. And in return, he taught her to fly. She was good. Better than good. She had instincts, could feel what a plane needed before the instruments told her, could land smoothly in crosswinds that rattled experienced pilots. Her instructor said she was a natural, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was supposed to be doing something. But there was nowhere to go with it. Commercial airlines didn't hire women. The military didn't take women pilots. Flying was a hobby, something she did on weekends when she could borrow a plane. The rest of the time, she was back on the farm, milking cows and wondering if this was all her life would ever be. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and suddenly everything changed. By 1942, the military had a problem. They needed pilots, thousands of them, to fly combat missions overseas. But they also needed pilots stateside to ferry planes from factories to bases, to tow targets for gunnery practice, to test repaired aircraft. Male pilots were being sent to war, and there weren't enough left to handle the domestic flying. So Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Love, two of the most accomplished female pilots in the country, proposed an idea that seemed insane. Use women. The military resisted at first. Women couldn't handle military aircraft. They weren't strong enough, disciplined enough, brave enough. But desperation won out. In 1942, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron was formed, and a year later it merged with another program to become the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASP. The requirements were strict. At least 35 hours of flight time, later raised to 200, a high school diploma, and the physical ability to handle heavy aircraft. Women from all over the country applied, and she was one of them. She packed a suitcase, said goodbye to her parents, and took a bus to Texas. Avenger Field in Sweetwater became her home for the next 6 months. The training was brutal. Ground school, navigation, meteorology, military protocol, and endless hours in the cockpit. They flew every kind of plane the Army had. Trainers, bombers, fighters, transports. Some of the aircraft were brand new. Some were damaged and barely airworthy. Not everyone saw it that way. Male pilots resented the WASP. They thought women were taking jobs that should go to men. Even though the women weren't replacing combat pilots, they were freeing them up to fight. The public didn't know what to make of it either. Some newspapers celebrated the women as patriots. Others mocked them, calling them publicity stunts or glorified taxi drivers. And the WASP themselves weren't even officially part of the military. They were civil service employees, which meant no military benefits, no insurance, no recognition. If they died in a crash, their families had to pay to ship the body home. And they did die. 38 WASP pilots were killed during the war. Engine failures, weather, mechanical issues, pilot error. Every time it happened, the surviving women had to keep flying. There were no memorial services, no military honors, just a quiet funeral and a new pilot stepping into the cockpit the next day. The work didn't stop. The planes still needed to be delivered. The war didn't care. She flew everything they gave her: fighters, bombers, cargo planes, gliders. She ferried aircraft from California to Florida, from Texas to New York. She towed targets while male pilots practiced shooting at them. Live ammunition, close enough that she could hear the rounds whizzing past. She tested repaired planes to make sure they were airworthy, knowing that if something went wrong, she'd be the one to find out the hard way. And through it all, she felt more alive than she ever had on the ground. But in December 1944, the program was suddenly disbanded. The war was winding down, and the military decided they didn't need the WASP anymore. Male pilots were coming back from overseas, and there was pressure to give them jobs. So the women were thanked for their service and sent home. No benefits, no veteran status, no acknowledgement that they'd flown every bit as skillfully and bravely as the men. Just, thanks, you can go now. She packed her things and took the bus back to Iowa. Back to the farm, back to the same small town she'd left 2 years earlier. Except now she'd flown P-51s and B-17s. She'd navigated across the country using nothing but a compass and a map. She'd proven she could do something extraordinary, and none of it mattered. Commercial airlines still wouldn't hire women. The military wouldn't take her. The only flying jobs available were as flight instructors, and even those were scarce. So she went back to the life she'd left. Helped on the farm, got married because that's what women did, had children, kept house, and every time she heard a plane overhead, she'd stop whatever she was doing and look up, remembering what it felt like to be up there, free, capable, alive. For decades, the WASP were forgotten. The government refused to grant them military status, refused to acknowledge their service. It wasn't until 1977, more than 30 years later, that Congress finally gave them veterans benefits. And it wasn't until 2010 that they received the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. By then, most of them were in their 80s and 90s. Some had already died. But the ones who were still alive finally got to hear the words they'd been waiting for. You were pilots. You were patriots. You mattered. She was one of the lucky ones. She lived long enough to receive the medal. She stood on stage, an elderly woman now, wearing a jacket covered in pins and patches from her WASP days. And when they handed her the medal, she thought about that 16-year-old girl lying in a cornfield, watching planes and dreaming of flying. She'd done it. Against every odd, every obstacle, every voice that said women couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't, she'd done it. The farmer's daughter who flew planes didn't just deliver aircraft during World War II. She proved something. She and the other 1,074 women who served as WASP showed that courage and skill have nothing to do with gender. They opened a door that had been locked for generations. And even though that door slammed shut again when the war ended, it never fully closed. Because the women who came after, the female pilots, astronauts, engineers, leaders, they walked through the crack that the WASP left behind. She'd never been more than 20 miles from the farm until she'd been everywhere. And no one could take that away from her.